Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Today, we'll be delving into the past and present of Myanmar's civil war with Senior Advisor to the International Crisis Group, Richard Horsey.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Myanmar has been embroiled for over 3 years in what many observers have called the most underreported conflict of modern times. The military's coup in 2021 ended a decade of civilian rule. Since then, supporters of the country's imprisoned democratic leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, formed armed resistance groups and began a civil war against the country's military. Meanwhile, regional ethnic groups, who have held grievances against the central government for decades, have formed their own militias and autonomous governing factions. The conflict has killed at least 50,000 people and displaced over 2 million. Now, the military government is fighting an increasingly uphill battle against a wide range of armed groups across the country. The junta has lost ground in recent months and looks increasingly unlikely to be able to reassert control over the whole country, leaving observers guessing as to what will happen next. In this episode, we dive into the history behind the current crisis and look at the principal actors involved. Who's fighting? What are their end goals? And how did we get to this point? For answers to these questions and more, we spoke with Richard Horsey. Richard is a political analyst and has been a close observer of Myanmar for over 25 years. He specializes in the politics and political economy of the country, as well as armed conflict and the illicit economy. Since 2009, he has been Myanmar advisor to the International Crisis Group, and also advises a number of other organizations on political and conflict risk issues. He was formerly the Myanmar representative of the International Labor Organization, working to end the practice of forced labor imposed by the previous military regime. He is the author of more than 100 reports on the country, as well as numerous articles and opinion pieces. He is a fluent Burmese speaker and holds a PhD in psychology from University College London. Let's listen into the conversation. So, welcome everybody to this bonus summer episode of Diplomatic Immunity. And I'm pleased to be joined today with Richard Horsey, who is an independent consultant and the Myanmar advisor to the International Crisis Group. And he's going to give us a little deep dive on Myanmar today and update us on the situation. Richard, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Kelly.
So, let's get to it with a little bit of a historical backdrop. So, Myanmar was a colony of the British back when it was Burma. And can you give us a sense of how did the colonization period end? How did Myanmar become Myanmar after colonization? And what role does that play with what's going on and what has occurred over the last decade or so?
So, Myanmar's independence was this kind of chaotic independence where, after the Second World War, the British just decided to get out. And so it wasn't a planned exit. It really happened, very, very quickly and without much thinking. And, this was at the end of the Second World War. Independence came in 1948. Burma was absolutely ravaged by the Second World War, huge amount of fighting. And it wasn't just the infrastructure that was destroyed. Society was deeply damaged by the war as well. Because during the colonial period, Myanmar had been governed as two separate entities. What was called ministerial Burma, the central Irrawaddy Valley, the lowlands where the Burma majority live, had been governed as a British colony. And the upland areas where many of the ethnic minorities live had been largely self-governing, even under British rule. These were called the frontier areas. They'd been allowed to keep their traditional systems of chieftains and self-rule and just pay a kind of tribute to the British. And so after the Second World War, when the British decided to get out, there was this very hasty and partial agreement reached that there would be a single country, that the upland areas would not be separate states, but they would all be part of this new Burma. And not everyone was in on that. Not everyone was at the meeting where that was decided. And so you had this kind of artificial state suddenly appearing. Because even in the past, central Burma had not always governed over these frontier areas. control in the pre-colonial period had kind of ebbed and flowed with the various kingdoms of Southeast Asia. So you had this sudden formation of this new state, which had never really been a state before. You had a lot of grievances because different groups in Burma had been fighting on different sides during the Second World War. And so there was a lot of grievances. There was also a lot of guns. The country was awash with guns. So you had guns and grievance and this new state that wasn't a state. And it devolved very quickly into a civil war with multiple different actors. And that civil conflict has continued for almost 8 decades up till today.
That's interesting because you see, after the Second World War, and because of the Second World War, there's a lot of other places that have issues like that as well, with different factions fighting on different sides, and some of that, is still at play today, or has come out in play over decades since the Second World War. And I feel like, even though it's a mostly fictional account, I feel like I have to give a plug to The Bridge Over the River Kwai. If nobody's seen the movie from 1957, it's a fantastic World War II movie. But anyways, I digress. So, what role does the military play in this? And as they, throughout the decades, became the dominant power in Burma, Myanmar, is that because of they were basically the most powerful entity in the country and could rise to power amongst these different divisions?
And they started off as a fairly weak entity. They lost all of their ethnic troops early on in the peace, who split off to form, these opposition groups, opposition armed groups, ethnic armed groups. And so, throughout the 50s, the country was roiled in conflict, but the center was very weak. It was a weak army. It controlled very little territory, but that was the kind of founding crucible of the country. And so, because of the kind of chaotic situation and because of the divisions which turned into political divisions as well during the 1950s, the military stepped in and carried out 2 coups, one in the late 50s, one in 1962, to basically say, look, we can't have civilians and politicians running this mess. They're not able to fix things. We need to get the security situation under control. And initially, there was quite a lot of support for that. There was a feeling that, the divisive politics and, all of these different politicians having their own pocket armies, that this was contributing to the chaos. So, a lot of people welcomed the coup initially and gave the military a chance to kind of fix this thing. But as in so many places, once the soldiers got their boots under the desk and they started to get comfortable, they didn't want to leave again. And to be honest, they didn't do a good job of fixing the mess, but also they didn't want to leave. And so you had the military and the state kind of co-evolving, if you like, over these decades. And the military built up a kind of state within a state. It had its own school system, it had its own hospitals, it had its own perks. And so it created this belief that only the military could keep this country together. Now, that belief wasn't held among the general population, especially after decades. But within the military and within this kind of elite, there was this kind of, it wasn't even propaganda, there was this self-belief that was just perpetuated, that only with a strong military and only with the military in charge could the country stay together. But the irony is that it's been those decades of military rule, of no compromise, of violence rather than dialogue, which has embedded the country's problems rather than keeping them in check.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's once you're in power, it's harder to leave, and we've seen this in military, governments across the board. I think in many instances, and that started to change in the early 2000s and 2010s with the rise of Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy party. And we saw them win a big majority in the mid 2010s and begin to sort of wrestle the power away from the military. How did that happen after decades of military rule? And how did people react, both within the country and outside of the country?
So really, the opening came when the old dictator Than Shwe, who'd been around for 20 years at this point, decided he wanted to retire. And retiring as an autocrat is a notoriously risky project, right? I mean, he himself had arrested and dismantled the economic empire of his predecessor, and he didn't want to be replaced by another strongman. The only way he could see himself living out a happy, peaceful retirement was to sort of change the system. And so a new constitution was put in place, which mandated power sharing between the military and an elected authority and a parliament. And this wasn't about democracy. For him, this was about breaking up power, making sure that no single autocrat could replace him and then, disturb his peaceful retirement and his family's wealth. But it had the byproduct of creating a situation where there was a crack in the political system and an opening. And that wouldn't really have been possible unless the new generation of 3 or 4 generals decided, okay, we need a change here. Things are going badly. They've been going badly for a long time. We need to try something different. Because the original plan was not to share power with Aung San Suu Kyi or some democratic demagogic force. The plan was to share power with a military proxy party, right? So it was the trappings of an electoral democracy, but without the real meat of it. But bizarrely, Aung San Suu Kyi was allowed to win the election. It wasn't rigged, and bizarrely, the general who was in charge by that point agreed to hand over power peacefully. That's quite striking, and it wasn't universally accepted within the military. There was a lot of shock. How come? This was the first peaceful transition of power in Myanmar's history. How come this general has decided to just hand over the keys to the kingdom to Aung San Suu Kyi, who, although she's the daughter of the founding father of the military and the independence hero, there was a lot of bad blood between her and the military. She'd taken the side of democracy. She was very critical of some of the generals who were leading the country, and so there was this feeling: why would you hand over the keys to her? You've got all the power, and so there was a lot of disaffection there, and that disaffection continued to simmer. And one landslide. Okay, she had 5 years in power. Among her supporters, she was just loved and adored and could do no wrong. Among the more politically engaged classes, the businessmen, many of whom who were ready to give her a chance, there was a feeling of missed opportunities, that she was loved and adored, but not the most effective leader. And so there was a lot of grumbling during those periods. There was a lot of feeling that the economy could have done better, that decisions that should be made weren't being made. There was a lot of delay and things. And the current coup leader was hearing all this. He was the head of the military, and he sort of had this feeling: well, the gloss has come off. She's been given her chance. She hasn't really succeeded, and this is my chance. She's going to do worse in the next election. I can form a coalition of the willing of the others, and I can be president. So he kind of convinced himself of this. His advisors had sort of convinced him of this. And living in this isolated capital, cut off from the population, not only him, but the entire military as an institution cut off from the population, completely missed the vibe, completely missed the feeling on the street, which was, whatever continued difficulties there were with the economy, with society, we've finally got a leader that we want, that we voted for, and that cares about us. And he completely missed that.
Yeah, and they don't want to go back to what they
Exactly.
experienced for decades. So that explains, why they stepped in when they did in 2020, and went ahead with the coup. So you mentioned that they misjudged the street. So what we've been having over the past few years is a number of ethnic armed militias that have risen up in response to the generals and what they did in the coup. So what are their goals, and how has what sort of kicked all of that off after the coup? And can you kind of walk us through the past few years of that armed conflict that's devastating Myanmar right now?
So the coup leader, Min Aung Hlaing, the commander in chief, I think he honestly believed that this could be a kind of technical coup, that he could step in, remove Aung San Suu Kyi from power, and leave everything else unchanged. He wasn't planning, mass violence and crackdowns and a return to the dark past. He thought he could do everything that Aung San Suu Kyi was trying to do, only better. A bit less democracy, a little bit less, sort of the liberal stuff, more military control and putting a grip on problems. But he wanted to grow the economy. He wanted Myanmar to continue to be, increasing its international engagement, its trade. he thought he could do all this better, just without the irritant in, the grit in the ointment of Aung San Suu Kyi. But yeah, he completely misread the mood in the country, and the reaction was absolutely visceral. I was in Yangon at the time. I was living in Yangon at the time, and there was 1 million people out on the streets within days of that coup. Peacefully demanding a return of Aung San Suu Kyi to power, just saying, we absolutely do not accept this. People from all walks of life. And so inevitably, the military, turned to the only tool that it really has, which is mass violence. And there was, killing on a quite astonishing scale, and troops using frontline battlefield weapons against crowds of unarmed protesters. Shocking scenes, and it turned a whole generation of young people who were out on the streets, who saw their friends killed, who saw the absolutely atrocious behavior of the military and this extreme use of violence. A generation who hadn't seen that. It had never stopped. It had been going on out of sight in the hills against ethnic people. But the center of the country hadn't really been touched by this. And so when this generation of young people saw the real face of their military and what it was doing, they decided to fight. They couldn't peacefully protest anymore. They were being killed. And so they fled the cities and they formed militias, people's defense forces, to fight back against the military. And many of the long-standing ethnic armed groups who have been fighting almost 8 decades, some of them for autonomy, gave them training, access to weapons, sanctuary for many of those who didn't want to fight as well. And so now you have two conflicts in a way, or you have two groups of conflict actors. You have the old conflicts, which are about autonomy. They're not about revolution. They're not about changing power at the center. They're about carving off an autonomous area where they just get left alone to live their lives without interference from the center. And then you have this revolutionary movement, armed revolutionary movement, which is about overturning the coup, defeating the military, bringing about a new political order. And while the enemy is the same, those two groups of people find common cause. But the objective is not the same. The longer term objective is not the same. There's some overlaps, there's some sympathies, but it's not the same fight. And I think this has been missed in some of the zeal of the revolutionary moment. That the end point of these two groups of fighters is different. And so now the battle is for the future of Myanmar. What we've seen is a really surprising battlefield weakness of the military. It was this kind of tree that had been hollowed out from the inside. And so it looked like it was really strong, but it turned out that, a few strong gusts of wind and branches started falling off. And that rot on the inside is not just because they've been in power for too long and become too comfortable. It's, corruption, it's bad leadership, it's all the wrong kind of reasons for promoting people. And so they're just not an effective force, it turns out, when they face a really determined set of opponents. And so they've been, for the last 9 months especially, they've been losing territory, they've been losing towns, they've lost territory faster than they've ever lost territory before. And to the point where people are starting to question, can the military carry on? Can the regime carry on? Is some sort of end point coming?
Yeah, and again, I think that's another sort of common theme that I think we see amongst dictatorships and military governments is this, when they actually have to produce and do things, you find that they're actually hollowed out for all the reasons you mentioned. I think that's kind of an across the board issue with some of these types of governments. We'll get back to the political issue of the different end goals for these groups when we sort of wrap up and I ask you what you, to get out your crystal ball. But can you talk a little bit more specifically about the humanitarian situation? Not just with the war that's going on now, but also we can't talk about Myanmar without talking about the Rohingya and the decade-long atrocities against the Rohingya. So, two kind of separate but related issues. Could you walk us through sort of both of those?
So the Rohingya, this population who are de facto stateless, 750,000 of whom were forced out of Myanmar into Bangladesh, 2016 to 2018 by the military. They've always been kind of caught between competing political currents or armed fighting as it is now, right? So they're caught in the middle. The Rakhine people, the majority in that area, have one of the most effective armed groups right now. Very large, very powerful. Basically, on the cusp of taking Rakhine State, a large state on the Indian Ocean seaboard, taking control of that state. And the Rohingya are there, and they're caught in the crossfire. Both sides, the Myanmar military is suspicious of them and their intentions. The Arakan army is suspicious that maybe they are not fully behind, its efforts, and so there's a lot of bad blood. There's a lot of recent history and old history of atrocities against them. And so they're really caught now, I think, as well. Bangladesh doesn't want any more refugees. It's trying its best to seal the border and prevent them from fleeing. They're being forcibly recruited by Rohingya armed groups, by the Myanmar military, in some cases by the Arakan army, the Rakhine armed group as well. And they're trying to work out how they can survive this. And it's a really tough situation for them. So we're a long, long way from where there could be any return of Rohingya from Bangladesh to Myanmar. I think that's well over the horizon. But we're in a situation where the remaining hundreds of thousands of Rohingya are in a really, really very difficult situation as well.
And I think it's important to note as well, correct, that this isn't just a military government suspicion of the Rohingya as well, right? I mean, Suu Kyi famously didn't really do anything to tamp down, and this continued under her leadership as well, correct?
Yeah, she went to the International Court of Justice in The Hague to defend the military against genocide charges. She definitely was not part of the solution for the Rohingya. And this I think the best gloss one can put on that was political expediency. The mood in the country was vehemently anti-Rohingya, very bigoted anti-Rohingya mood across the country at that time, and that she felt that it would be politically damaging to her to go against that. But I think that's about the best one could say. I think one could also say that she herself had her own prejudices in that regard. I think.
So Myanmar recently went forward with a conscription plan. Has that changed things? How's it been received by normal folks in Myanmar?
Yeah, the activation of the conscription law, which has been on the books in various forms for decades, but has never been activated. I think this has been greeted with dismay, basically, because not only in practice does it mean that young men are now at risk of being forced to fight for an army that they hate, but it's a sign, a signal from the military that they are not thinking of an off ramp. They're not thinking of how to get out of this mess. They're doubling down and are determined to fight their way out. And so it's really been a trigger, I think, for another round of kind of real concern in the country about where things are going. It's deepened the malaise, and it's prompted thousands and thousands of particularly young men to flee the country to avoid the risk of being recruited.
Yeah, sounds like another ongoing war that's been in the news a lot lately. So where's Suu Kyi now? What's her status in all of this?
She was arrested on the day of the coup, and she's been essentially incommunicado in prison since. She's been moved to a house a couple of times when the temperatures in her cell in the prison in Naypyidaw reached life-threatening levels. There's no air conditioning in her cell. It's a kind of metal roof, purpose-built building in Naypyidaw prison under the hot sun. But yeah, she's basically incommunicado. The point of the coup, I think part of the point of the coup was to remove her from the political landscape. So there hasn't been any effort to kind of use her, instrumentalize her. She's had access to almost no visitors. Only one foreign visitor, the former Thai foreign minister, has met her, but nobody else that we know of. And so she is really incommunicado. And that means that events over the last few years since the coup have happened without her. And that means also that people aren't quite sure what she thinks or what she would think if she knew exactly what had happened and how she would position herself. So there's been a slight concern that if she's given her voice or if she's released at some point, what is she going to say? And would that sort of divide people? she's obviously, throughout her career, championed nonviolence, and so there's a question of what she would think about the armed revolution and whether she would be supportive of that. But also, she's always seen herself and the NLD as the political leaders of the country, and you now have a more diverse kind of resistance and opposition movement that includes different political streams. Youth, especially, are very prominent, but also it's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious resistance movement. And so that's a departure from historical Burmese politics, where you have the majority Burman Buddhist ethnic group kind of calling the shots.
Have you seen any on the revolutionary side of things? Have you seen any potential future leadership step up, or is it sort of just a broad swath of different groups with different leaders all sort of doing their own thing with the end goal of revolution and return to democratic governance?
There's quite a lot of coordination. There's a common goal for the moment as well, or at least a common enemy in the military. But there isn't a sort of standout leader. There's no Zelensky.
Hmm.
Um, and in a way, Aung San Suu Kyi is such a popular political figure that as long as she is there in the background, it's hard for another political leader to emerge. She's kind of occupying that space, even in silence. And that has been a challenge, I think, because although different institutions of resistance are well run and as best as they can be, kind of coordinated, there isn't this sort of sense of someone who can lead and someone who can speak for the movement, and that's been a challenge, I think.
Yeah, and that makes your point about her silence all the more pressing because you have these groups have this huge elephant in the room of what would she say, what would she do if she was there, or what will she say if she eventually gets out of prison. So that's a whole nother question hanging over all of this. So in most conflicts going on in the world today, they don't just well they happen within borders, but there's not just the local actors involved. Whether or not it's regional actors or international players more broadly, is there a sense of that going on in Myanmar as well? What are other countries playing? What role are they playing? Countries like China, Russia, the U.S. What's their role in this? What's their stance on all of this?
Thankfully, Myanmar is a place where the neighbors are not vying competitively for pieces of the country. Right? This isn't a Syria. This isn't an Afghanistan. This isn't a Sudan. Even all of Myanmar's neighbors basically want a stable Myanmar. It's also managed to avoid the US China geopolitical competition in the region. Myanmar is not one of the axes of that competition. And so Myanmar is one of the few topics on which you can actually have a conversation, for example, in the Security Council, without it devolving into sort of competing blocks. First ever Security Council resolution on Myanmar was passed at the end of 2022. China abstained. And China is not really supporting this military. China did not appreciate the coup, does not like the coup leader at all, has made its dissatisfaction very clear. And so it is possible to have international conversations about Myanmar. The problem is there isn't a very clear idea of what should be done or what could be done internationally to fix the problem. There's a dearth of good ideas. And as you said earlier, I mean, Myanmar is one of those places which is overshadowed by the other conflicts and crises that are afflicting the world at the moment. So there isn't a lot of bandwidth to give attention to it either. Um, China, has taken a rather prickly stance towards the military regime. Russia has taken a very different approach. Myanmar and Russia have kind of found each other in the dark after the coup and the invasion of Ukraine. They saw a value in this relationship, which had basically been an arms sale relationship, but was upgraded to more of an aspirational political trade relationship. But it remains aspirational. There's not much that Russia wants from Myanmar, to be honest. Russia sees Myanmar as a useful location in the Pacific. Russia aspires to be a Pacific power. Having another close ally in the region is useful in that regard. But of course, Russia is very distracted by its neighborhood right now. It isn't at a moment where it can sort of start really thinking beyond its neighborhood and Ukraine. And for Myanmar, what do they want from Russia? I mean, there's been talk of tourism and trade and so on, but really there isn't much there. And the main thing is that Russia will always have to defer to China on this file. Beijing is very clear that this is our backyard. Russia needs that China relationship.
Yeah, especially now. Yeah.
Yeah, China has very clearly sent the signal. We set the tone on Myanmar, and that's why when China abstained in that Security Council resolution, Russia did the same, because it wasn't going to go against the Chinese lead. So.
All right, so we're going to get you out of here on one last question, and it's obviously not going to be an easy one, but how do you sort of see things playing out over the course of the next few months or year or so?
So right now we're seeing a moment of historic Myanmar military weakness, of regime weakness, but they don't have a lot of options. Their backs are to the wall, and I think all of the signals are that they're going to try and fight their way out of this. So, I don't think we're going to see a sudden collapse of the military, or a moment where they say, "Look, we just have to negotiate to get out of this." I think they're going to fight. This is an existential battle for them. But what we are seeing is that other armed groups in the country, particularly the ethnic armed groups, are at a moment of historic strength. And that means that, for decades, they've felt that their goal of autonomy can't just be won on the battlefield, that at some point they're going to have political negotiations to turn sort of, battlefield leverage into political success and to get the autonomy or federalism that they want. Whereas now they're actually taking the territory that they want. They're taking control of their homelands. They're putting in place administration. They're getting what they would have hoped to get at the negotiating table. They're getting that on the battlefield. And so what we're seeing is these kind of mini statelets emerging in the uplands. Now, this isn't a collapse of the Myanmar state. You could say that the Myanmar state was already pre-collapsed. This is just an extension of the situation that's ebbed and flowed over the last decades, where the central state has not really controlled the uplands of the country at all. But it seems like a one-way street at the moment. The military isn't able to do much about this. And so we are getting these autonomous statelets emerging all around the upland areas of Myanmar. And that leaves a weaker, smaller state at the center, controlled by the military, where the situation is much more difficult. There, the post-coup resistance forces are not as militarily strong. They don't have as much experience. They're not as well armed. But also the central plains of the country are places that are much more difficult to fight than the mountains, and where a modern mechanized army like the Myanmar military has a much greater advantage. So, that's a picture of political change coming in the periphery, albeit a very difficult one, and one with a constant threat of violence or airstrikes and so on from the army, and a continued kind of contest and battle for power in the center of the country.
All right, Richard, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me on the program, Kelly.
Thank you again to Richard Horsey for his time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This episode was produced by Freddie Mallinson and Nicole Butler. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.